Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're about to look at one of the most incredible, almost unbelievable transformations in military history. I mean, we usually picture the Continental Army of the American Revolution as this stoic, perfectly unified front of patriots, right? But the reality back in 1775, it was vastly different. Today, we're unpacking the unbelievable story of how a chaotic, totally disorganized militia was basically salvaged, structured, and forged into a disciplined fighting force, one that could actually take on the British Empire.
To really grasp the sheer scale of this transformation, we've got to establish the horrific baseline of the American forces at the outbreak of the war. British General Burgoyne confidently declared that trained troops are invincible against any numbers of an undisciplined rabble. And honestly, from the British perspective, that's exactly what the colonial forces were. By June of 1775, you've got 15,000 New England militia besieging 6,000 British regulars in Boston. Sure, these colonial guys were highly motivated, absolutely, but they completely lacked military discipline, structure, and basic supplies. It was a mess.
Part 1. The Undisciplined Rabble and the Chaos under Artemus Ward.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Under Artemus Ward's kinda loose direction, the militia did manage to fortify the heights overlooking the Charlestown Peninsula. But the Battle of Bunker Hill perfectly illustrates the fatal cost of a disorganized military. When the British launched their frontal assaults on Breed's Hill, the Patriot militia actually poured some devastating close-range fire into the British ranks. They held their ground fiercely at first. But then, the chain of command completely broke down amid the chaos. While men are fighting for their lives in the redoubt, hundreds of reinforcements literally just milled about in confusion on Bunker Hill. No one knew who was in charge, they ran out of ammunition, and when the British launched their third attack, the militia finally broke in the face of British bayonets. It was a bloody, horrific scene. And while it was a massive morale boost, because, they stood their ground temporarily, it proved they couldn't sustain a coordinated defense.
Which brings us to a massive, really pressing question. The Patriots proved they had the fighting spirit. I mean, the British lost over 1,000 dead and wounded at Bunker Hill. But raw spirit doesn't win a long-term war against a global superpower. So how do you turn a disorganized, unsupplied rabble into a professional army that can actually follow up on its successes? The answer was a completely new type of leadership.
Part 2. Washington enters the camp.
That critical turning point finally arrives on July 2, 1775. The Continental Congress knew they desperately needed a drastic change in direction, so they sent a man who would literally alter the course of the war. Just look at the contrast between the outgoing commander and the incoming one. It's striking. On the left, we've got Artemus Ward. He's a 47-year-old militia officer, but he was sickly and really had very limited military experience. Then, on the right, George Washington. He had been living as this wealthy Virginia plantation owner, but crucially, he was a veteran of the French and Indian War. He'd served as a lieutenant colonel of militia, giving him military experience that exceeded nearly any other American-born officer at the time. Plus, through his marriage to Martha Custis, he was one of the richest men in America.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the immediate psychological impact Washington had. It was undeniable. This observation from Dr. Benjamin Rush, a congressional delegate from Pennsylvania, captures it perfectly. He said Washington had so much martial dignity. Washington just possessed this natural air of authority. His sheer physical presence commanded immediate respect. Just by arriving in camp, he began to shift the tone. But, looking the part of a general and actually fixing a broken army, those are two very different things. Because what Washington found upon his arrival left him absolutely aghast. The army was in a deplorable state. It was essentially destroying itself from the inside out. The camp was just this massive jumble of tents and ill-placed latrines. Earthworks were left totally unfinished. But the absolute biggest issue was the culture. Officers were actively fraternizing with their men. Soldiers were simply coming and going as they pleased. Discipline was virtually non-existent. Men lacked proper muskets, and uniforms were incredibly scarce. It wasn't a military camp. It was more like a chaotic gathering of armed civilians.
Part 3. The Administrative Reforms.
Washington knew that before they could fight the British, they had to fix themselves. So he broke his overhaul into immediate, actionable steps to rebuild the Army's culture. Step 1, he had to establish a visual hierarchy. He ordered officers to wear sashes or cockades so they could actually be distinguished from the enlisted men. This was specifically to fix that chaotic chain of command issue we saw at Bunker Hill. Step 2, enforce discipline. He introduced severe punishments for desertion, for fighting, and even for swearing. He drew a hard line. And step 3 was this incredible medical mandate that we really need to highlight. This third step was just as vital as any combat tactic on the battlefield. Smallpox had erupted across Massachusetts, and it was ravaging the Bostonians inside the city. So Washington ordered his men to be inoculated. It was a radical, really risky administrative choice at the time, but the sources note that this practice, which the British also utilized, by the way, may have quite literally saved the Continental Army from total destruction by disease.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that Washington had to rely on strict discipline and administrative control, simply because he couldn't rely on firepower. 9, that is the estimated number of gunpowder rounds available per man at this time, just 9 rounds. A massive ammunition shortage meant Washington couldn't launch major offenses. He could do little more than hold the fortifications around Boston. Discipline was quite literally the only glue holding this fragile army together.
Part 4. Building the command structure.
You see, discipline wasn't just required for the enlisted soldiers in the trenches. Washington desperately needed a unified, functioning chain of command at the very top. The Continental Congress had appointed a mix of generals for him to work with, chosen for both practical military and political reasons. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredibly diverse, almost wildly eclectic mix of personalities Washington had to manage. You've got Nathanael Greene, a young, self-educated Rhode Island Quaker who'd eventually become his most able commander. You have Charles Lee, an arrogant, irascible, but highly experienced career soldier serving as second-in-command. There's Israel Putnam, the veteran Old Put from the French and Indian War. John Sullivan, a super-aggressive officer from New Hampshire. And Horatio Gates, a capable but disillusioned former British officer who is privately pretty contemptuous of Washington. Getting all these strong, clashing personalities to pull together, that was a monumental task in itself.
Which leads us to the ultimate challenge Washington faced. He had to take independent-minded New Englanders, stubborn riflemen from Virginia and Pennsylvania, and somehow unite them. I mean, think about it. Every single man in that camp had more instinctive loyalty to their own individual colony than to any shared national cause. The true victory of Washington's early administrative and structural reforms wasn't just, cleaning up latrines or assigning sashes. It was getting these deeply independent, regionally divided men to finally view themselves as a single, unified Continental Army.
By January 1776, after enlistments expired and harsh winter conditions took their toll, Washington's force shrank to less than half its summer peak, down to just 9,000 men. But here's the thing. Those 9,000 were no longer an undisciplined rabble. They were a structured military machine, which leaves us with a really provocative thought to end on today. If strict administrative reform and sheer force of will could forge a functioning army out of absolute chaos, could that newly disciplined force actually outlast the mightiest empire on earth? It's a fascinating question, and one that sets the stage for the rest of the American Revolution. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.